Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. So now we're on to project number 3, or the third version of the project. And what we're going to do is we're going to allow the users to enter in any number of employees and enter their hours. So in the slide that's being shown right now in the second bullet point, you'll see that there is the output that we want to try and get. So I'm going to show you a demo of what we want out of this project here. So I've just brought the terminal screen up a little bit just so we can concentrate on what's in the terminal and enter an employee name. So we'll enter a name and John worked 40 hours. Add another, yes, enter an employee name, Bill, and Bill worked 55 hours. Add another one, enter an employee name, Kate, and Kate worked 35 hours. And we're going to break out of the loop. And there you go. You'll see at the bottom here, the bottom section, there's the output. And those are the lists that are going to hold our data. And some of the data is what we get from the user, of course, the total number of hours. And some of it we're going to calculate, such as the number of regular hours and the number of overtime hours. And again, there's your output. So we got to make a few adjustments to program 2B. So in this application, there's a concept called a run loop. And the run loop is the main running of your program. So when the program starts, we're going to ask for a name and the hours worked. Then we're going to call a function that's going to add data to the list and perform the calculations as required. And then we're going to ask to add another. If they say yes, then that process will continue. And the only time we'll break out of that loop, of course, is if they enter an N in our case. So that's the basic structure of how the program works. And I think if you think about it this way and you break it up into big chunks, it's a little easier to absorb. So what are these lists? Well, we're going to need one for an employee name. We're going to need one for the number of hours they worked in a given week. We're going to need one for their regular hours and one for their OT hours. Now we have all the pieces to perform it for a single person in Python Project 2B, but we want to make this a lot more dynamic. So we're going to, first of all, we're going to create the loop, and then we're going to call a function, and we're going to let the function do all the work. And then once that's completed, in other words, they're done entering their data, we're going to exit the loop, and then we're going to print the results. So let's get started. I'm going to grab our project 2B, and that's posted on GitHub, the link's below. And I'm going to do a save as, and I'm going to save it as project 3. And this is where we're going to start. I'll get rid of some of these comments, because we don't need those anymore. And recall, we have a function that's going to populate those lists for us and perform our calculations. So let's think about what we need to do. I think the first thing we should probably do is we should probably look at creating a function. So this is just a definition. So we'll declare a function to update the lists, okay, and perform calculations. Now, recall that if you have a function and you don't know what goes in there right away, and you don't want the compiler to complain, we can use the keyword def space, and then that's the name of our function, calculate underscore hours, open and closing brackets, and a colon. You could just write pass in here for now, okay? And the compiler won't complain. But let's take this code out, and we're going to cut it out. And we're going to replace the pass with that code we just cut out. And We have a few little formatting problems. When I copied and pasted, the indentation wasn't correct, so I'll just fix that up. Just hitting the tab key. Okay, and I'm going to comment this out because later on we're going to replace these simple variables with lists. And I'll just copy this out. But our logic's good, so we might as well just keep this. Okay, now that's our function, and eventually we're going to call that function after we collect the data. But we wanted a loop, remember? Because we want one or more employees and their hours. So what kind of loop should we use? I think we should use a do-while loop. And this is just going to collect all the data. And one of the things about while loops and do-while loops, we need to what? We need to create a loop condition. So that's our next step. So I'm going to create a loop condition up where we declared our variables. And it's just going to be continue underscore looping. And I'm going to set it to true. And that will be our condition for looping. And of course, now we're going to make a loop. So in here, I'll say while continue underscore looping is true. So the double equal sign, capital T, true, colon. And now what we have to do is we have to put this code indented inside of the loop. Otherwise, it's not considered inside the loop. Okay, so we'll just indent that stuff over. And right now, we have no way of changing that continue looping to false. So this will continually run. That's not what we want. Otherwise, we're going to have an endless loop. So we need to modify our loop condition. And recall when we did the do-while loops, all we're going to do is we're going to ask the user whether they want a loop. So in here, I'll create a little variable called loop underscore again. And we're going to grab some input from the user and enter another. Sure. And a question mark in brackets y /n. Now the y doesn't really mean anything. The only thing that's really going to break you out of the loop is the n. But it probably looks a little more palatable if we do it this way. Okay. And now what we're going to do is we're going to change that continue underscore looping variable if the user entered n. So loop underscore again. And we're going to put that in an if statement. And if it is n, then continue looping, we'll set it equal to false. And that way we break out of the loop. Okay, good. Now, the next phase, what we got to do is we should probably look at testing. We should test this loop. So, enter an employee name. Let's enter a name, John, 40. You can put a Y in there or just leave it blank, right? And enter another employee name, Bill, and Kate, and hours. So you see here our loop is working. We're not doing anything with the data yet though, because we still have to call our function, and we're going to have to modify our function because we need to use lists, and we need to modify our variables because they are simple variables, and now we're going to create lists out of them. So let's go up top here, and under int hours week, we'll change that to list, just so we know what kind of data type we're dealing with. And I'll just make them empty, an empty list. Same with the employee name. Whoops. We'll just make that a list as well. And int regular hours, we'll change that to a list. And int OT hours, we'll change that to a list. Okay, and we don't have to change the int regular hour limit. We can leave it at 40. Now I said this was a constant, but it's not really a constant. You can change it. It's just a notification to other programmers that, hey, don't touch this. Okay, it's a constant by capitalizing the letters. Okay, so let's now let's call the function. Now, what are we going to send in the function? Well, we're going to send in the name, and we're going to send in the hours that we capture every time we do a loop. Okay, so we need to go into our calculate hours, and we need to create the input parameters. So it doesn't matter which order you put them in. Okay, so I'll call it emp for employee underscore name and num underscore hours. So now when we call the function, we're going to have to, these are positional arguments. So the first one is the employee name, and the second one is going to be int hours week. So those are the two arguments that you need to fulfill the parameters of the function. Okay, let's fix our function up. Okay, so again, we're using lists. We're not using simple variables anymore. So we need to get rid of the block commenting. And remember, we're sending in something called num hours. So we'll just change that there. And also, we're not storing anything in simple variables, right? We got lists. So list regular hours. And we're going to do an append, right? Because that's how we add data to the end of a list. What are we going to put in there? Well, we're going to put in there the number underscore hours. So this handles the case when there's no overtime, right? Just like before. And instead of a simple variable, we're going to use a list. And in here, we're going to do another append. And we're going to append 0 because there's no overtime if they work less than the overtime limit. Okay, the next one, int regular hours. Well, that's if list regular hours is equal to the limit, right? Because this is the case whereby we have more than 40 hours. And we'll just append the limit, which is 40. And in the next case, I don't think I've shown you this before, but you can actually do math when you do the append within the parentheses. So here, list overtime hours, append. And to calculate the overtime, we're going to take the number of hours that was entered, subtract it from the overtime. So we don't have anything called int hours week, right? We called it num hours because that's a parameter that we're sending into the program. And what I think we should do now is just check over, make sure everything looks okay. And if you take a look at this, we are getting a little cue here from Visual Studio Code. What's the cue? Well, employee underscore name is not being used. That's why it's kind of grayed out a little bit. So we need to append that too, right? There you go. You see how it turned blue? Perfect. Okay. Now, what I'd like to do, I think we should do here is we should probably look at making sure, just go over things, just give it a once over and see if the program is giving, or Visual Studio Code is giving you any hints if there's any issues. Okay. Well, our output will fix it later. So I like to take things in little so-called bite-sized chunks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out those lists just to make sure that our data is there. Because if your data is not there, no matter what you do, your output's going to be wrong. Because the output is derived from the lists. So let's just print out these lists and we'll see what's inside them when we run the program or after we finish looping. Okay, so I've got my 4 lists and let's run the program. Okay, enter employee name. I think you guys know what's going to happen here. John, Bill, and then Kate. Okay, now we hit the N. If we were to enter N, of course, the loop's going to end and we should print out that stuff. Let's take a look here. What do we have here? Well, I have an empty list. Which one was that? List hours per week. That was the total number of hours. And I didn't capture it. Well, the total number of hours is the input parameter for that function, isn't it? It's called num_hours. So let's just append it right here. And I'm going to, of course, add the number of hours. And that should take care of that empty list. So now we hopefully are going to run this again. And I'm going to test it just to make sure. So I'm entering the same data that we just entered a moment ago. And get out of the loop and take a look. We now have everything lined up. Now notice here, John, next line 40, 0, 40. Okay? So we're relying on the fact that these indexes are going to match up. So John worked 40 hours, no overtime, right? 40 regular hours. Bill worked 55 hours, 15 hours of overtime, and 40 regular hours. And I think you can calculate what Kate did. Okay, let's take care of the output. Now what we're going to do is we're going to loop over these lists. And we're going to extract the names and all the hours data. So I'm just going to copy and paste this, and the reason I'm copying and pasting it, just in case I make a boo-boo, right? I can keep that as a reference because we know that it does work. The logic's correct for a single, but it's not good enough for a loop yet. Okay, so we need to create a loop. How do we create a loop? Well, first thing I'm going to do is uncomment all this stuff. And then we need to put this print statement in a loop. So let's make a loop. And I'm going to just use a regular while loop because we are going to loop a predetermined number of times. In other words, the length of the list. So we'll start off our loop condition, I is equal to 0. And while I is less than, and you can pick any list because remember, they all have the same length, correct? And we're going to get, I'll just pick list employee name. We'll get the length of it. And now this loop should run over the entire collection. And we have to fix our indenting here. And now I think what we should do is we should look at the data that we're printing out. Okay, we don't have anything called str employee name, right? We are holding it in a list. So let's change our data type to a list. And how do we refer to individual items within a list? We use the square brackets, and we can use I. and I will be incremented a little later, but let's just fix up the data types. So that's list employee underscore name, I. And then this one here is just list underscore regular hours. And we're going to use the square brackets and I again. And the next one we got to work on is we have to work on this overtime hours. So we'll change that to a list, square brackets, and I. And the final one is going to be list hours week, and that's going to take in square brackets and I. Okay, you see there's really not that much editing here, is there? Sweet. Okay, now what we need to do is we need to make sure we increment I every time it loops. Otherwise, you'll end up with an endless loop. And I'll increment it by 1, so it'll keep going to the next index. And once it reaches the last index, it's done. The loop will end by itself. So let's just try it out. John, 40 hours. Bill, 55 hours. And Kate, 35 hours. Do you want to do another one? No. And then it's going to jump to this output area. And there's your print statements. Congratulations. I know it was a long journey, and there's lots of moving parts to this lab, but I think it's a good idea if you study how everything works in here. Because of all the moving pieces, it's quite valuable in terms of learning how Python works. Thank you very much for watching the video, and please subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.